I went to Fresno in 1969 at the end of a decade of professional practice in the LA art scene, which was unbelievably macho. And in order to fit in, I had had to suppress any indication of gender in my work. But by the end of the decade, I was sick of it, and I started to wonder if it was possible to make art that did not require my disguising my gender. And I went to Fresno because I couldn't have done that in LA. It would have been too risky. I didn't realize that I was embarking on this hugely radical step, although I knew I wanted to create a feminist art practice, and I wanted to see if I could develop an educational program for young women artists that was, in a way, a reaction to the lousy education I had had at UCLA, where my male professors had been horrified by any female content in my work, my color sense. And so I went to Fresno for a year and a half. And in the first semester, I put up a flyer asking if there were any young women who wanted to be artists, and said I was doing this class specifically for them. It never crossed my mind that I was going to encounter the fact that there were a lot of young women who thought they wanted to be artists but had no idea what that really meant. Nevertheless, I signed up about 15 girls from Fresno, and in the fall, I started this class, which ended up being the first feminist art program in history. And I started a program where I steeped them in women's history. By then, I was studying women's history. I was reading women's books. I was looking at and searching for women's art, and I shared all that with them. For a year, they did not read anything by men, because the way I structured the program, by particularly the second semester, they could basically get 15 units almost by working with me. 2 classes and then independent study. So for a year, we worked in our own space because I wanted them to understand that to be an artist, you had to have a studio. So we rented a space. Everybody paid $25 a month in the days you could get space for that little money. And the girls, I call them the Fresno girls still, they say to me, "Judy, we're 60. And I'm like, yeah, but you'll always be the Fresno girls to me. But anyway, the girls found space. We set up the space. I taught them how to build walls. I taught them how to turn this raw space into workspace. In fact, one of them, Suzanne Lacey, who became a famous internationally known performance artist, bronzed a pair of boots that she bought for the program because they all came in flip-flops. And I'm like, excuse me, you're going to build a wall. You're going to drop a hammer on your toe. You have to have boots. So even getting dressed, how they dressed, how they presented themselves, we talked about that. We practiced shaking hands and saying, my name is Suzanne Lacey, as opposed to, my name is Suzanne, which is how they all introduced themselves. And then I organized the class. Later, people said I organized the class based on consciousness raising, which was very popular then. But actually, that's not how I organized the class, because even before the women's movement started with consciousness raising techniques, I taught part-time at UCLA Extension, and I used to do something I saw my father do when I was a child. He was a labor organizer, and he had all these political meetings in our house, and he used to go around the circle and ask everybody to speak about a particular topic, and that included the women. And so that's where I learned to develop an inclusive pedagogy, which I used in Fresno. If somebody felt uncomfortable about speaking, and often they did, they could pass. But what we did in those circle meetings was we talked about their experiences, and then we looked at those experiences in terms of whether there was potential subject matter for art. Now, it's really important to understand that at that time, women's experiences were not considered fit subject matter for art. Maternity, motherhood, birth, menstruation, sexual abuse, none of those subjects were part of the art discourse in terms of the contemporary art world. So to mine that material caused actually an explosion in the studio, because these are the things the girls were really concerned about. In fact, one of them years later told me, she became a sculptor, she said she didn't take a sculpture class at Fresno State because they would have demanded that she make white cubes, and she didn't want to make white cubes. She wanted to use the material she was comfortable with, which was needle and thread, fabrics, sewing, and in order also to get them to more deeply explore the subject matter we would talk about in these circle conversations, I realized that they were all pretty good at role playing. And so I started to do role-playing exercises. I wrote a play called The Cock and Kump Play, which was about housework, which of course was a very fraught subject at the time, like who does the housework. And there's a famous Leonard Cohen song, "Democracy is Coming, Democracy." And one of the lines is about who's doing the housework, the dishes, the cooking. So it was a really big subject. Anyway, so the Cock and Kump Play was a very important and pivotal exercise, pedagogical exercise, because the girls would take turns as acting out the construct of masculinity and then acting out the construct of femininity. And of course, it was very interesting. They were much more comfortable with the construct of femininity because the construct of masculinity required them to become aggressive, become, in the case of the play, actually violent. But it was important because those little voices they used to introduce themselves had to be counteracted, because if you go in your studio with a very little voice, you make very little art. In order to claim physical space, you need to feel confident in yourself and confident in being active, aggressive. So all those things were involved in the program, and also they could use whatever materials they wanted. That was very important, because at that time also materials and techniques were gendered. Throughout my time in Fresno, which I always knew would be limited, I also worked in my studio working on the other half of my goal, which was how to open up my own art-making processes and bring in my real content and my interest in subjects that related to being a woman, what it meant. And that was reinforced by what I was doing with my students. They were starting out in a way that I had been unable to. I had to move away from my experience as a woman. They were starting out and learning how to be artists without having to deny they were women. But the explosion that took place in the studio as a result of the permission I gave them and all this hidden content and subject matter, all these experiences that they had had and never been encouraged to use in their art making, it was like lifting a lid on a boiling pot, and there was like an explosion. I was a young artist still, I wasn't even 30, and it was really scary to me. I didn't have any real experiences. I hadn't taught that much. I was coming out of my own studio experience, but I had struggled in my studio with the construct of femininity and the way in which it prevented me actualizing my ambitions as an artist. So I knew what I was trying to do for them. I was trying to make that process possible for them. At the same time, it was scaring the hell out of me. I'll tell you a story about that. The girls decided that they wanted to make these costumes, cunt costumes, and they wanted to develop cunt cheers. And a feminist theoretician named T. Grace Atkinson, I invited her to come to the studio, and the girls wanted to go meet her at the airport. So they dressed in their cunt costumes. We went to the airport in Fresno, which is a very conservative part of California. There we are. The girls are going, see you, see you, see you. And I'm dying. I'm like, oh my God. I mean, I'm a middle-class girl, you know? I'm like, but I didn't want to like stop them. I didn't want to interfere with their enthusiasm or their growth. On top of which, a Shriners convention got off the plane. So there I was, responsible for having stimulated and unleashed all of this youthful energy, and I needed help myself. And I turned to an artist named Miriam Shapiro, who was older than me. I knew she had had a difficult time as a woman in the abstract expressionist movement in New York. She and her husband had relocated to California, and I invited her to come up to Fresno to give a talk. Actually, that was very interesting because she had never given a talk on her work, even though she was in her 40s. And she went through her own demons. I remember her in my little apartment behind my studio in a small town outside of Fresno. She went through all these terrors. She felt like if she got up in front of people and talked about her work, she was going to grow a penis. I think it's really difficult for people to understand now the kind of fear of female power that surrounded my generation and earlier generations. And challenging that, unleashing female power, as I was doing in the Fresno studio, was frightening, challenging, and threatening. In fact, the girls and I did a talk at UC Berkeley, and some man jumped on the stage and wanted to like punch one of the students in the face. I mean, he was so upset. So I brought Mimi up. She did a talk. She saw what the girls were doing. She and her husband had been hired to start a new experimental radical art school called California Institute of the Arts. And they came back to me at the end of the year in June, after we did this public presentation, performances, we did an exhibition, a whole bunch of people came up from CalArts, and they offered me a job at the new school to bring my program to the new school. Well, naive that I was, I thought, oh my God, this is just unbelievable. You know, I went around saying it'll be the first time a major art school addresses the needs of women, because instead of our little ragtag $25 a month studio, they were going to give us a big studio, equipment. They were going to provide us with an art historian who was going to take my little slide library of women artists that I and then my students and I were assembling. They were going to turn it into a real archive. They were going to give us funding, a budget. It was like, oh my God. So I took a bunch of my students with me. Mimi helped them prepare their portfolios. And we all made a trek up the freeway back to, well, I went back to LA. For them, it was a whole new experience. And so in the fall, CalArts was not ready. The new building was not ready. They'd been meeting in a former convent in the valley. So we were meeting in various living rooms, like Mimi's living room, and there was a designer named Sheila Dettre who now works at Yale, who started a whole design program, feminist design program, because feminism swept through CalArts. And we were meeting in these living rooms, and we had an art historian named Paula Harper, probably the first feminist art historian. And she suggested, since we had no studio, why didn't we do a house, a project about the house, and we could rent a house. We all thought that was a great idea. And the girls fanned out and started looking for spaces. They found an old abandoned house, and we started working on it now. A lot of things happened in that period when we were working on the house. I had taught the Fresno girls building skills. I had also taught them discipline. I had required that they work 8 hours a day. Now, I did not realize that the new students in CalArts, who all were from privileged backgrounds, they hadn't gone through that training. They resented it. They didn't think they should have to work regular hours. They wanted to just work when they wanted to. And they resented me, and they resented Mimi, and there was a whole lot of struggle, but some of it was creative struggle, what happens. At any rate, there were also issues that I didn't understand at the time that had to do with class, because I had brought these kind of lower middle class girls into a high level art school. And also there were issues at the school that I didn't know anything about because I didn't have to go to faculty meetings. I don't exactly know, probably because Mimi was probably afraid that I was quite outspoken, and she was probably afraid that I was going to make a scene when I heard some of the statements by some of the male faculty. For example, John Baldessari, who's a very famous artist. He was one of the people who came to the Fresno studio, and later one of my students told me that John Baldessari had walked up to her sculpture, which was a soft sculpture of a female figure laid, splayed out, and he'd put his toe of his boot up the vagina. I didn't know there was that kind of hostility. I was protected from it. But anyway, that all like ended after Womanhouse opened. And then the subsequent events around it. Womanhouse was an unbelievable success. Thousands of people streamed into it, including Gloria Steinem. I didn't even know that either. And one of the most effective aspects of Womanhouse was the performances. We used the living room for our performance, and we did performances that we had done in Fresno, had been developed, and new performances that we developed. And of course, the Cock-and-Come play was one of the highlights of the performances. I'll never forget the head curator of the LA County Museum sitting on the floor watching the Cock-and-Come play with his girlfriend, because everybody had sat on the floor. And the play is like, will you help me do the dishes? Help me do the dishes? Yeah, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he got really agitated. And as the play went on, he started squeezing his girlfriend's leg in rhythm to the play. Poor girl. Anyway, it was a huge success. I was completely ecstatic because I understood that Womanhouse was the first female-centered art installation to appear in the Western world. And the response indicated that there was a huge audience for feminist art. There wasn't even a term, feminist art, yet. I mean, we made it up. And the response was incredibly heartening. But then there was this conference on women in the arts at the Corcoran in Washington, and Mimi and I presented Womanhouse together. I don't know what possessed the Corcoran to bring all the activist artists, art historians, art critics, and art writers from around the country together, because of course we all met each other, and that jump-started the national feminist art movement. But anyway, after the presentation, Mimi just went crazy. She started yelling at me and telling me that I had manipulated the audience into liking me more than her. And now the thing is, I have faults, but being manipulative is not one of them. I'm one of the most what you see is what you get kind of people. Our relationship went completely downhill after that. She never forgave me for what she saw as my taking attention away from her. I mean, I just was being myself. So by the end of the first year, I had a 2-year contract. I had tendered my resignation. Also, we moved onto the campus after Womanhouse, and I hated it. I hated all the colored doors, like you didn't know one door from another except by the color. I hated the corporate sort of environment. I hated the bureaucracy. I always thought bureaucracy was a function of male dominance until I started my own institution. And then it started getting bureaucratic. And then I'm like, oh, you're kidding. Women are bureaucratic too? I'm out of here. But anyway, so by the end of the first year, I tendered my resignation. I spent my second year in a basement studio with those few students who felt loyal to me and continued to work with me. After the end of 2 years, I left. I left everything. My students, the slides, my program, everything. I walked out and I started all over again with Sheila DeBrettville, the designer, Arlene Raven, an art historian, both of whom worked at CalArts, and we started the first independent feminist art program called the Feminist Studio Workshop, which then led to the Women's Building, which lasted for 20 years and trained hundreds and hundreds of young feminist artists. And the legacy of Womanhouse continues even today. First of all, it opened the way for new subject matter, new techniques, new ideas, a new way of looking at art. It opened the way for that, for generations, and it's still being felt. There are woman houses that get done all over the world. There's a cyber woman house that's done out of Penn State, and the deputy director of the Research Institute at the Getty, Andrew Perchuk, who's an expert in Southern California art of the 60s and 70s, considers Womanhouse one of the most important installations of the 20th century. The few points I'd like to make that I didn't really stress enough was, first, the issue of content. I've worked over the course of my 50-year career with literally hundreds and hundreds of women, and I've also worked with young male students. And by and large, one of the problems with studio art education is that it's inherently biased against women by being focused on form rather than content, because women tend to want to make art of meaning and content. It's not a surprise. Most women are socialized towards relationships, interactions. So by allowing the women to focus on their personal content, of course, that gave them permission to develop as artists and start down an artistic path that would have been not open to them in a traditional art education program. Secondly, even as is demonstrated in our U.S. Senate and Congress, the women legislators tend to be more collaborative. That is true of women generally, and it was true of my students. They naturally, first in Fresno and then at Womanhouse, they naturally tended towards collaboration. Okay, as contemporary evidence, for example, what's happening in legislatures around the country and in Washington, it seems that women legislators tend more towards collaborative practices. And that is something, just like a content orientation, that I have found very prevalent among women. In fact, when I was in my first decade of professional practice, I tried to collaborate with my male artist peers, and it was always fraught with struggle. And that was not at all the case as soon as I got into the Fresno studio. Collaboration became very easy, very seamless. Performances grew out of collaboration. And there was a change when I brought my program to CalArts. There was a definite change in terms of some of the higher, more privileged girls who came into the program wanting to do their own rooms. Most of the rooms were collaborative, but then there were some who wanted their work to be individual and solo. And there were also other kinds of class issues that I really didn't understand until much later when I interviewed one of the Fresno girls who had come to CalArts, Nancy Yodelman, and she talked about how she didn't have very much money. She had to work in order to go to school at CalArts, even though they gave her a scholarship. She didn't have parents who could support her, and she had to make her living expenses, so she worked in the cafeteria. And she told me the story about having been with a boy at CalArts at night, and the next day he was in the cafeteria line and he saw her with a hairnet on her head, and he never spoke to her again. So there were class issues that were at work in the refusal of some of the more privileged girls. They're upset about having to work. It wasn't just work a long day. It wasn't just that they weren't used to working long days. They hadn't gone through the training I had given the Fresno girls in terms of professional practice, and that was exacerbated by the privilege. Well, the other thing that collaboration opened the way for was performance, because the girls could collaborate on performances and often did. For example, the famous Waiting play by Faith Wilding, she didn't write that. It came out of the performance workshop where everybody participated in writing. I can still remember sitting there waiting. And I didn't know that much about performance, except when I was a child, I used to do performances on my back porch and get all the kids of the neighborhood involved. So I drew on that, just like I drew on my experience of my father, organizing. I drew on a lot of childhood memories and experiences that I had not been able to use in the restricted role of artist as it was defined by men in the 60s. So I also grew from that experience. And as I said at the beginning, one of my goals was to figure out how to reunite my experiences as a woman with the visual language I had developed in the first 10 years of my career. And one of the reasons I wanted to teach young women is I figured by helping them do what I hadn't been able to do, which is build their lives as artists on the basis of their experiences as women, that I might learn how to do that myself and bring back together my art life and my female life. Because in the 60s, one of the common things I was told all the time is you can't be a woman and an artist too. And what Womanhouse did was Womanhouse challenged that. It not only demonstrated that you could be a woman and an artist too, it demonstrated that female experience could be as much a pathway to universal human experience as male experience has been for centuries. It's a good thing that the Getty undertook a project called Pacific Standard Time, which involved documenting and celebrating Southern California art in the 60s and 70s, because Womanhouse was basically almost erased from art history due to CalArts. CalArts, instead of taking pride in having hosted not only the first feminist art program in the world, but also stimulating feminist art programs and feminist consciousness across the institution, erased the entire history of the feminist art program. And in the 90s, some young women, students, who were experiencing exactly what I had experienced in school in the 60s. There have never been any great women artists. Women can't be artists. I mean, just the same thing. No exposure to women's history, no exposure to women's art history. Found archives of the feminist art program in the dumpster. And they retrieved them, and they did this whole panel and exhibition called the F Word. But still, CalArts did not, and CalArts also refused Mimi Shapiro's archives. And the only reason that changed, in my opinion, is that the Getty gave a big grant to Otis Art Institute to do an exhibition and a major catalog on the Woman's Building, which grew out of Womanhouse. And it was only then that CalArts began to claim the history of Womanhouse. So, of course, this fits in to the larger problem of the erasure of women's accomplishments that the National Museum of Women in the Arts is devoted to countering. And my career has also attempted to counter that, particularly in relationship to my own history and legacy and that of many other women artists. In terms of its place in my artistic development, well, all through this period, as I said earlier, I was working in my studio. I was trying to figure out how to bring together my interest as a woman, my increasing interest in women's history, which I was studying and unearthing, and my visual language that had taken me a decade to develop. After Womanhouse, I moved on to the Feminist Studio Workshop and helping to found the Woman's Building. But by then, you know, I always had a burning desire to make art from the time I was a child. And I've taught not that much, even though I've tried to have my teaching have some meaning. But by the time I was a year into the Woman's Building, I was ready to devote myself to bringing together my interest in women's history, my art language, the study of China painting I'd been doing for 2 years, and my desire to counter the erasure of women's history with the naivety of youth, where I thought with my paintbrush I would teach the world women's history. Of course, I didn't teach the whole world women's history, but I've taught a lot of people women's history through the dinner party. And so then I got completely wrapped up in studio practice again. And what happened with the dinner party, and much like Womanhouse actually, in terms of its impact on audiences, you know, there still is this idea that there's a very small audience for art, although there's also the idea there's a big market for it, hence all the art fairs. But I learned that there was a huge unserved audience for art about women's lives and real issues, even beyond women's lives. Of course, women's issues are human issues, but there is a big audience for art of meaning, of art that addresses the issues that most people care about, and that art is hard to find. And seeing the way in which people connected to Womanhouse or connect to the dinner party changed my course as an artist. I couldn't go back to that small elitist mindset that I tried to fit myself into in the 1960s. A lot of people don't understand how few art students actually become practicing artists. The percentage is very, very small. Hence, how remarkable it is that 9 out of the 15 Fresno girls are still acting as professional artists, and several of them have become very, very well known, and that's fantastic. Out of CalArts, there are also some who went on, but some also, I don't really know how to explain this, some have become quite bitter, which is disappointing to me because my principles as an artist and as a teacher and as a human being have always been to be generous. And that's what I tried to do with my students, even though they sometimes thought my demands on them were not generous, but they were generous in the sense that I was trying to teach them what it requires to be a professional artist. And making art is not for everybody. Making art requires dedication, persistence, the ability to accept rejection, which is often very difficult for girls, for young women, and also the understanding that it is increasingly difficult to have a long and sustained career in the face of marketplace demands. So I feel thrilled that so many of my students, not only from Fresno and CalArts, but later when I started doing teaching around the world and around the country, a number of those students have gone on to have really remarkable careers. So a teacher can make a big difference. But one of the things, when I went back to teaching in 1999, I discovered there are a lot of teachers who use the university art education system to promote their own careers, and they're not generous, and they don't care about their students. And I understand it because it is so difficult to make a living as an artist, and universities are one of the two patronage systems, the gallery system and universities. But the state of art education, in my opinion now, is shameful.